Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience. Rose, 36, was always more worried than she needed to be. She was very pretty, short, always with shoulder-length hair and a long silk strand that barely opened her beautiful brown eyes. Rose smiled a lot, which made the corners of her eyes already have shallow wrinkles in them. She was fair-skinned and very easy to manage. After the birth of her only daughter, Rose gained 20 pounds. It took her a long and painful time to lose it. She wanted terribly to live up to her husband's lofty status. Henry Benson was a plastic surgeon. He always told her he would love her any way he could. After all, he didn't love her for her looks. That was too silly and superficial. Henry met Rose back in high school and fell in love with her. She was very bright, but modest and quiet. Rose never refused if she was asked to cheat. She helped everyone in her studies, but she did not go to dances. She had a very religious family. Rose was the same way, but without the kinks. When she fell in love with Henry in 8th grade, she was terribly embarrassed about it. But you can't keep a secret in a bag. Her classmates noticed the way Rose looked at him with amorous eyes. They reported it right away. They thought Henry would laugh at Rose. But he took a closer look and realized that that was exactly the kind of girl he wanted. Their romance began when they were 15, and now they have more than 20 years of a strong relationship under their belt. In a happy marriage, Rose gave birth to her beloved Elizabeth. She is now 10 years old. Henry finished his training as a plastic surgeon and got a job at the best clinic in town. People came here from all over the region, as it was the only clinic with the only plastic surgeon for several hundred miles around. Henry earned his reputation on his own. He had a steady income that allowed him to maintain a large private home downtown. Rose had completed a course for cooks. She loved to cook and even worked in the school cafeteria and a local restaurant for a while. When she found out she was pregnant, she quit her job right away. By that time, Henry was already making a decent income, and his wife's salary was relatively small compared to his income. They could not conceive for a very long time. It was all about Rose's psychological state. She was claustrophobic. Because of this, she had to tear down all the doorways in the house and make large arches in their place. Fortunately, the house was big and had high ceilings, and she didn't feel comfortable in it. There were fewer attacks after Elizabeth was born. She was a joy for her loving parents. Elizabeth attended many sections. There were many clubs, and she was persistent and hardworking, just like her mother. That day, the girl was raring to go to her new ballroom dancing class. She hated that she was taken there even without experience. Elizabeth was praised by her teacher. She was just as good as the girls at the dance school. After all, many of them were engaged literally from kindergarten. They didn't go, and they didn't need to. Look at the blizzard that's playing out, her mother, long-haired and already gathering a cocoon on top of her head, was telling her with a bag of dance uniforms in her hands. I can't miss it. There's a new dance tonight, and if I miss it, they'll put me in the back. And our choreographer said I could be in the middle because I'm already good at it. The girls would die of envy if I did that. I have to be there, even if it's the end of the Veronica. I'll go there. Elizabeth's eyes blazed with fire and passion. At this time, the driver drove up and entered the house. Henry had a good acquaintance, Oswin, who worked as a cab driver on weekends. They drank beer and watched soccer together, and if he needed to get somewhere, Henry would dial his buddy's number. Right away. Oswin always gave him a discount, and Henry always tried to support Oswin financially by leaving more money than he needed. Oswin, well, you tell her, Henry said. Rose was going to go to the dance studio in a snowstorm like this. I can imagine what's happening on the roads now. The young blonde boy with the perpetual hedgehog on his head smiled. There's nothing terrible going on the roads. Everything is running as usual. I just took clients to the airport. They didn't even cancel the flight. Yes, it is snowing. But it's only one winter. It'll be like this for another 3 months, and that's the best-case scenario. Rose shook her head. You won't even let me go to school. Now, it's a snowstorm. The almost-grown daughter was indignant. She was smart, sensible beyond her years, and sometimes too serious. School's around the corner. Don't make it up, Rose retorted. Oswin crumpled at the doorstep while Rose stood there, torn by her doubts. Finally, Henry came out of the shower and resolved the situation by asking Oswin one simple question. Will you take me there? Sure, no problem, he promised his friend. Then there's nothing to think about. Go to your dad's. Just have Oswin bring you back when it's over. Will you tell him the time? Of course. Thank you. Elizabeth brightened when her father was around. She was becoming a little girl again. Elizabeth was Daddy's little girl. The 10-year-old girl got into a yellow cab and the car drove through town. The blizzard was intensifying. Rose stood at the window, putting everything aside. She told her daughter to call as soon as she got to the studio. But Elizabeth still did not call. Oswin entertained his best friend's daughter with stories all the way. The dance studio was in the middle of nowhere. It was a long drive, or, given the traffic, an eternity. Elizabeth laughed in the back seat, unbuckled. Oswin was kind to her, but was forbidden to buckle down until the car came to a stop. The standard telephone ringtone rang out in the cabin. Oswin picked up the phone and answered it. He was talking about weekend plans when his car skidded and went into the oncoming lane. Shit. The cell phone flew out of his hands. Oswin tried to dodge it, but couldn't. A car drove by, hooked him hard. Elizabeth didn't have time to realize anything. She heard the squeal of brakes, the headlights of the oncoming car, on even in daylight, blinded her eyes. Then a powerful impact flipped the car several times. Elizabeth didn't scream. She tried to protect her head, as she had been taught in the airplane. When it was over, Elizabeth opened her eyes. She was saved by her seatbelt. The front window of the car was shattered, a drop of blood at a time. She guessed with Oswin, big trouble had happened. She tried to unbuckle, but she couldn't. The metal was preventing her from just getting out over the top. The roof had gone up hard. Elizabeth had seen cars explode in movies after an accident. It frightened her. She tried to get out, calling for Oswin, but he apparently flew out through the windshield. She was the only one in the car. Elizabeth started screaming and calling for help. She was scared and sick. She was crying. After a few minutes, the car door closed. Elizabeth saw some boy tugging at her. "Help me." "Push there," Elizabeth shouted. Like a child, he began to push the door open. Together, they managed to open it a few inches. The boy was younger than Elizabeth, about 7 years old. He shoved his head and half of his body into the car. A knife glinted in his hands. Elizabeth was frightened, but quickly realized that he only wanted to cut the belt, that he managed to get out fairly quickly. "Hurry up," he commanded. Elizabeth climbed out of the car and found herself outside. The boy took her by the hand and led her somewhere. She was so frightened and confused that she followed him without saying a word. "Wait a minute. I have to call my mother. She'll be worried," Elizabeth realized. They stopped and looked for the phone. Why hadn't it occurred to her to dial her parents' number earlier? Probably out of shock. Elizabeth realized she had left the phone in the car. It's in there somewhere. She should go back. "That's Uncle Oswin in there, isn't it? Where are you taking me?" He seemed to be lying near the front windshield, and he was badly hurt. He needed help. Elizabeth began to think and was about to walk back when the car exploded in a blast, knocking them off their feet. Elizabeth cried out. She didn't open her eyes immediately. The same boy was standing over her again. "Come on, you're all wet." Elizabeth realized that she could not help Uncle Oswin. Barely had he survived. She was scared, so she took the little stranger up on his offer. He led her to a completely collapsed cabin where they were greeted warmly by her grandmother. "Grandma, this girl was in an accident, and I helped her out of the car on the highway." "What were you doing there again, you bully?" Antonina asked sternly. Trying to sell some stuff again, the boy shook his head. Elizaveta realized that he must have taken the knife with him just to sell it. Why else would a child carry it with him? Elizabeth remained silent. She was frightened and very cold. Grandmother Antonina warmed. Water on the stove, which she stoked with wood the old-fashioned way. She played the part of a girl, gave her dry things, gave her tea, and fed her porridge. After that, Granny went to the scene of the accident, but came back very quickly. I couldn't get through our outskirts. They're so rarely clear. The snow that we sometimes don't walk for months, she said. That's all right. I'll send you off tomorrow morning. You get to the post office and call the police from them. You tell them the girl slept over. We'll probably have people looking for her. Yes, Bayo? Granny asked. The boy nodded confidently. Grandmother slept away on a small sofa. Only one large room was heated, the one with the stove. The others were closed doors. It was cooler there. In the evening, before going to bed, Grandma read them a story. Elizabeth was used to fairy tales by now, but she felt so good and comfortable. After that, she and Bale hung out for a while longer, trying not to wake Grandma. In the morning, Bale got dressed and left. An hour later, he was brought home in a police car. A tractor was ahead, clearing the road to the house. Where's our missing person? Smiled the man in uniform. Couldn't get through here yesterday. Bale managed to get her out of the car. Yeah, brought her here. While they warmed her up, fed her. It got really dark. I wanted to go through, but I couldn't get through. What was the meteorite? My parents must be worried. Sure they are. My mother even had to call an ambulance yesterday. Come on, we'll take you. Elizabeth gathered her things, hugged Antonina, and thanked her and Bale. The cops didn't have time to take the girl home. Henry drove there himself. He ran into the house, and when he saw Elizabeth, he rushed toward her. She was even a little frightened, but she quickly realized that Daddy was just overexcited. He kissed her and tried to hold back tears in front of strangers. You're alive. How did you get out? Daddy, what about Uncle Oswin? The father held his daughter tightly to him and smiled at her. What's going to happen to him? He's got an iron head, after all. Lying in the hospital, he was thrown through the windshield. It turned out to be a bad one. He was conscious when me and your mama drove up, wasn't he? Oswin said he strapped you in and you probably didn't get out of the car. Your mother and I almost lost our minds. He hugged his little princess for a long time longer. Then he dialed his wife's number and told her everything was okay. The police officers said goodbye and left, and Henry walked over to his grandmother, who was sitting peacefully in the corner. How can I thank you? He asked. You can't. What thanks can there be for a child? It's a sin. Go with God, son, she said. Henry felt uncomfortable. There were no words enough to describe how much he felt indebted to this woman. Will you at least let me do something for you? He asked. Grandma shook her head. Oh. Henry walked out of the house and was leading Elizabeth to his car when a boy caught up with him. Uncle, can I ask you this not for saving Elizabeth? I would have saved her this way or that way. She's a good one. It's just something I really want to do, but I can't do it myself, Henry smiled. Ask whatever you want. You can buy me flowers. Roses in white. A little bouquet. Henry shrugged. It's probably Grandma's birthday soon. Okay, what do you say? I'll drop Elizabeth off and stop by on my way to work. Henry drove his daughter home, where Rose met her. The mother cried and kissed her baby girl all evening. She personally called her choreographer to give her a chance to show herself again. Meanwhile, Henry, transfixed with gratitude, bought 3 beautiful, large white roses and drove back to the lodge on the spur of the moment. Thank you very much. May I ask you to take me somewhere else? The child asked. And it's just around the corner. Henry nodded, and the little boy disappeared out the door. He returned to Henry already in his jacket and hat. The clothes were obviously very old, off someone else's shoulder. They must have been worn about 20 years ago. Wait, I gave you 3 roses and you only have 2. Henry glanced at the boy and he sat quietly in the back seat of his car. I know. Take me to the cemetery downtown. Henry sighed and started the car. They drove to the cemetery. He went with him, just in case. Henry felt his responsibility for the baby. That's my mother, the boy said. Henry's heart clenched. He looked at the date of death and realized she had been dead a long time. You must not remember her at all, he said. The face in the picture seemed familiar to Henry, and he looked more closely. Yes, she died. As soon as she gave birth to me, Grandma said, I was only 2 months old. She raised me herself. I don't remember my mother, but I go here and talk to her and imagine she can hear me. Henry wasn't listening to the kid anymore. He remembered that face from the cross, his patient looking at him. One and the same. He had done her surgery 3 years ago, no more. But then, how was it possible that she had died 7 years ago? Henry drove the child home and hurried to the clinic. He put on a robe on the fly, received several visitors who had been waiting for him in the waiting room for a long time. And when they were all gone, he got into the database. He remembered the woman well. True, he remembered more her new face, the one he had given her. He had changed the shape of her nose, the cut of her eyes. She had not asked to be made beautiful. She had not asked to be made beautiful. She had only one request, to make her different. When asked by the plastic surgeon, the lady answered that she wanted to break with the past and start a new life. She said she had been abroad for a long time and had been in an unhappy love affair, and she wanted to change everything. Apparently money allowed her to do that. She and Henry picked out what could be tweaked and had a series of complicated surgeries. Sometimes a man would come to her room with flowers. The patient said he was just a friend, but she was obviously very dear to him. The man kept asking how dangerous it all was, what the health consequences might be afterward. Veronica, there she is, exclaimed the doctor, finding the right line in the computer. Her phone number was also there. What to do? The coincidence was astonishing. Although maybe the two women just looked alike. Henry sighed. Was it worth calling the man? Bother him. He thought for a few minutes, then dialed the patient's number. He wasn't just a bystander, a plastic surgeon. Picking up facial parts, understanding their structure was his job, one that someone else might have gotten wrong. But here, there was a striking resemblance. If they weren't twins, the pictures probably got mixed up. Or they'd managed to get the dates of the patient's death mixed up. And it was Veronica. He couldn't be wrong. And he knew it. Henry invited the woman in for an appointment, saying he wanted to check the results of the surgery and make recommendations. The woman came to see him early the next day. I'm sorry. I'm in a big hurry, she said from the doorway. You wanted to examine my face. It won't take long, will it? Henry shook his head, looked her over, and sat down across from her. To be honest, I didn't exactly call you in for an examination. She smiled embarrassedly. I'm sorry. I'm married. If that's what you mean. That's not what I meant. I've been married a long time myself. Here's the thing. He told her that he had seen her exact replica in the cemetery. My God, what are you talking about? Yeah, she probably just looks like me. You don't think someone pinned my picture there, do you? She asked. Henry shook his head no, but perhaps you had a twin sister. I thought I'd ask you about it because the woman had a son. What if you were related to him? That would be great. He's being raised by his grandmother alone. The boy is so lonely that he goes to the cemetery to talk to the gravestone. Veronica shook her head. No, I didn't have any brothers and sisters. Veronica hesitated. Her plump lips curled into a disgruntled smirk. What is it? The doctor didn't understand. How stupid am I? My God, I'm adopted, not my own daughter. I never thought about it for some reason. Or rather, I wanted to find my parents, but I didn't go looking for them. I promised my mom and dad, when they told me the truth, that I wouldn't even try to find my family. I love them very much, and always thought they were my parents. Sometimes I thought it would be worthwhile to look for my roots. But it never came to that. Then perhaps you have a nephew." Henry smiled. Veronica made a few calls and put all her business aside for the day. Together they drove to the cemetery. Henry quickly found the right grave. "Here it is. Look, don't you two look like each other?" Now seeing Veronica and being able to compare, he knew he was not mistaken. My God, there is no such thing. It's not me, but it's me. She took a long look at the date of birth, which was also her birthday, and realized that all her life she had had a twin sister. It's not easy to accept. A few days later, Henry was leaving the hospital. As the workday drew to a close, the phone rang. It was Veronica. "I'd like to meet," she declared. "Yes, okay. Any news on your relation?" he asked. "Yes. If you can, come to my place. You can now." Harry got in his car and went to the address his patient had given him. He arrived at the luxurious mansion, where a maid escorted him inside. The interior of Veronica's house was impressive. But what struck him even more was that Bale and his grandmother met him there. Soon Veronica herself appeared. She was a tall blonde man with glasses, looking a little younger than... "Henry, I wanted to say thank you. If it weren't for you, I never would have found a family. Antonina was also a foster mother to my sister, as were my parents. I couldn't find a real mother. It was a mess back then. There was just no data. There was a mess back then. There was just no data. There was a fire at the orphanage, which destroyed the only documents that could help. But most importantly, I have Bale now. We were living in horrible conditions. I was shocked when I saw it. No one should have to live like that. And now we're together." Veronica hugged Henry and invited him to dinner. He accepted the invitation and saw a well-fed, well-dressed, and happy Bale. It was a joy for him. As Henry was leaving, Bale whispered to him that he called Veronica Mama, and she let him. On the way home, Henry was thinking about all that happened when he found Veronica's records. There was a notation in them that the girl was infertile. She hadn't talked about it. He certainly hadn't asked, but now she would be raising her own nephew. And given that the genes of the twins are identical, he could be considered her blood son. Thought made her feel good and easy. How wonderful that everything had worked out so well for them. Except that Veronica's husband's face did not please Henry at all. He kept looking at him angrily. Victor was silent, and every smile he smiled seemed strained and fake. At home, Henry shared the happy news with Elizabeth and Rose. They were glad that everything had worked out so well. "Gee," Rose reasoned, "what fate the twins have. How could they have given these little ones to an orphanage? There are times when illness and poverty make it impossible to feed children, and not everyone accepts termination. So they leave their babies with someone who can raise them. It's still wrong." Elizabeth silently changed the cake. She was happy for Bale and his grandmother. The next weekend, Elizabeth got her father to call Veronica so she could meet Bale and play and go for a walk. Veronica was delighted at the suggestion. Bale was very reserved and unsociable. Hale was very reserved and unsociable. Grandmother never took him to kindergarten. And now he was getting ready to go to school in September, but he did not know how to communicate and make friends. Elizabeth was brought to the park by Rose. Veronica came on her own. The women quickly found common ground. Veronica was 4 years younger, but it was as if they had known each other all their lives. They got along quickly, and soon they called each other just to chat. The children also became good friends. Bale and Elizabeth went to the circus together to see the rides. Elizabeth got her ever anxious mother to go on the Ferris wheel. Rose was terrified, but it wasn't so scary with Veronica. Henry was glad his wife had finally found a friend. No, Rose occasionally dated former classmates, but they never really got along. Rose said that Veronica's husband, Victor, had reacted negatively to the fact that his wife had brought strangers into the house. She had to convince him that they were relatives. The house was big. Veronica had always dreamed of having a real family. But Victor didn't want children. The fact that his wife turned out to be infertile was good news for him. He was great at business, helped run the business after her parents died and got into it. Over time, he became her friend and then the man she loved. When Elizabeth had a birthday party, she invited some girls from school to it. The children had their own table, and the adults had their own. Veronica came to the party. Henry personally brought Antonina so the woman could be with everyone. Veronica said that in the big house, where there was no need to chop wood and stoke the stove, the woman was bored out of her mind. She began knitting, joined the library's literary club, kept looking after Bale. The holiday was at the cottage. Henry had music playing. The kids were having fun with them. An animator dressed as Spider. Man was engaged. 2 companies formed at the adults' table. The men were discussing beer and soccer. The women were discussing soap operas and housework. Toward the end of the evening, Veronica and Victor quarreled. Rose unwittingly witnessed them arguing behind the house. Veronica was angry, and so was Victor. Later, Victor went to the wall. "And you, Rose, didn't think that maybe Bale really is Henry's son. It wasn't just that he was hopping about him, and he even tracked down the boy's relatives. He couldn't have brought him home. That's where you put him on my neck." Rose was shocked at what she heard. Why had he said that? She stood there with her mouth open, and the man just turned and walked to his car. "What happened?" asked Veronica. She saw that her husband was saying something to his friend. "Nothing," Rose replied, looking at her differently. "Is it really all true?" "Does Veronica know about this?" she said to herself. "My God. After all, Bale is 2.5 years younger than Elizabeth, so Henry cheated on her. If Bale is his own son, their marriage is definitely over." Rose could no longer be among the guests. She cited a headache and retired to her room. Emotions swept over her, and Rose cried, then began to gather her things. When Henry entered the room, she was already standing with a suitcase in her hand. "I sent Veronica and Bale and Antonina home. The others left too. What's going on? What are you doing?" Rose was standing with her things. "Elizabeth and I are going to go to the house now, pack up our things, and I'm going to take her to my godmother's. You and I need to be apart for a while. In shock, Henry couldn't find anything to say. They hardly ever fought, and they'd never had a fight like this before. Rose and Elizabeth left the cottage, and Henry followed them. He called his wife, but she didn't pick up. Henry caught up with them only at home, where Rose was standing with a suitcase in her hands. "What on earth is going on?" He was indignant. "Bale your son?" Rose asked him point blank. "No," Henry shrieked unnaturally high. Rose looked into his eyes and realized she didn't believe him. I guess Victor was right. About him. Maybe because he was nobody really, and Henry just found a place to put his own son. Chose a rich patient who was also infertile. Rose realized that these thoughts are not much like the truth, like reality. Henry wasn't like that at all. She'd known him for so many years. But then why did it never leave her that Victor was right? Rose left, taking an uncomprehending Elizabeth with her. Henry was left with himself in an empty house. 2 days passed. Henry wrote 100 messages to which Rose never responded. He didn't understand what his wife was getting into her head. He needed to talk to her. Henry took a leave of absence at his own expense. He couldn't work in his condition. At the end of the 2nd day, he called Veronica. "I can't get through to DNA. Is something wrong?" she asked. "It was Victor. He made complaints to me too. I don't understand what happened to him. He was always there for me. Why is he reacting this way now? What happened?" When Bale and Grandma came in the house, it was like he went off the rails. "He told me Bale could be your son too. That's crazy. You know, I think it's all about the money. Victor is very greedy. He's trying to take over the firm, and he wants to make me a housewife. He wants to go from being just his father's assistant to the head of the firm. Maybe he's afraid that his place will now be taken by my direct heir." Henry shook his head. "I hadn't even thought of that. Maybe that's the way it is. Are you two officially married?" Veronica shook her head. "No. He keeps asking me to marry him, though. But for some reason, I can't say yes. There's something stopping me. I guess I understand that it's not so much me he wants, and not just me. After all, if he just wants to get rich through you, you should run from him. You never know what he's capable of. Aren't you afraid to stay with him? And if he was prevented by the fact that you have heirs, it means that he planned from the beginning to be the only robber of the company. I sometimes still see him as a selfless kid who took care of me, supported me after my parents died. They loved to travel. And one day a cruise ship went down. I was told later that my father helped others escape, but he didn't make it himself. Mom could have gotten in the dinghy, but she put a young girl in her place. She told me my mother loved me. Those were her last words." Veronica cried. Bale came up to her, put his arms around her. "It's okay. Don't cry, Mom." Veronica smiled at him through her tears. "You are my joy," she said. "Boys," Bale left for Elizabeth's room, and Veronica and Henry continued to talk. "I'm the one who officially adopted him. Antonina suggested it herself. She's old now, and the boy needs a mother. And he's genetically my own son. Except that my little sister gave birth to him for me. I will see her in him. He looks like her, and he looks like me." Henry nodded. "And to you, I came with him for a reason. If he's got Rose fooled, we can change her mind. I have a friend at the clinic that does all the tests, including DNA, without exception. I think Rose should believe the test results." That day, not only Bale and Henry were tested, but Veronica as well. Within 24 hours, the confirmation came that Bale and Veronica were related by blood. Even the test couldn't tell which of the twins was the child's real parent. After all, their DNA is identical. Also, the test showed that Henry is not even a distant relative of the boy. With the results, they arrived at the doorstep of Rose's godmother's house. "How could you not believe me?" Henry asked, reproachfully. Rose studied the documents and looked at her husband guiltily. "I'm sorry. I was always afraid that you would find someone else. I am a mouse." "What did you see in me?" Henry shook his head and put his arm around her. "Silly, come on, get ready. I want to take you and your daughter home as soon as possible. It's just unbearable without you there." Rose asked Henry's forgiveness for a long time, and Elizabeth's too. The test helped her calm down and banish her fears. That day, though, she experienced a very different emotion. She gave Victor a scandal. "What did you say? Did you know they almost had a family falling apart because of your speculation?" "Yeah, he needs more than that. Let them prove the kid's your kin first, and then he'd push him around." Veronica rummaged in her purse and threw the test results in Victor's face. "He's my own son. See, because he was born of my twin sister. I told you, I did my research. But even if I hadn't, I'd still want to help that boy. I've always wanted children, and you haven't. What's the matter? Are you afraid someone's going to take power away from you in the company?" Victor looked at Veronica with hatred. "What are you talking about, you idiot? Truth hurts my eyes. Why are you so nervous? Come on, let's go. I don't want to see you here anymore, and don't you ever come near me with flowers again. You, because of your greed and spite, almost separated two people who love each other. They have a daughter. What were you thinking?" He wanted to hit her. His eyes were full of rage, but he held back because she was not afraid. She knew she would sue the bastard if he dared to lay a finger on her. Besides, there were cameras in the house, and he knew it. The recordings couldn't be deleted. They were copied to the security firm's hidden server. So Victor packed his things, called a car, and left. He did not forget to take her favorite mug and a gold ring, which he gave her for her last birthday. Veronica only shook her head. She had to shake her head. How could she have lived with him for so long? He left and Veronica called Rose. She had told Rose, and she had rushed over with a bottle of wine and some cheese. Henry, hearing the news, was only happy for Veronica. She would be much safer away from that creep, and she would never be alone now. Bale was now her own son by all accounts. Antonina was like a second mother to her. Time passed. Bale went to the same school Elizabeth went to. She often stopped by and asked him if anyone was hurting him. Today's children are often violent, and Harry got a lot of abuse from people around him. He didn't like fights and didn't understand without thorough insults. He found it easier to be friends with girls than with boys, and Veronica became a frequent visitor to Henry's house. Rose was glad of that. They became like sisters to each other, except that one day Veronica disappeared. Bale found out about it. He called Henry at work. Uncle Henry, Mom is nowhere to be found. She was supposed to pick me up today, but she didn't come. My teacher called home and called Grandma. My mom got her used to taking cabs, so she came to pick me up, and my mom's phone was off. That never happened. She always had a spare battery with her, and the phone is the kind that doesn't run out of power. Grandma says to wait, but I'm very afraid. I feel like something is wrong. I can't lose my second mom. Help Henry dropped everything and rushed off in search of Veronica. She had to be somewhere. People don't just go missing. He toured every place she'd been at work. She hadn't been seen since this morning. Henry got some cops he knew, and her car was tracked. My guys arrived on the scene. There was blood in the cabin, but not so much as to say Veronica was dead. It's more likely she was attacked. It's not clear where they took her yet. What happened? The policeman asked him. Henry passed the information on to Rose, and she, taking Elizabeth, went to Veronica's house to reassure Bale and her grandmother. Several weeks passed. Rose and Elizabeth were still living at Veronica's house. During this time, each experienced despair in their own way. The first was Bale. When he saw Rose on the doorstep, he shut himself in his room. The boy stopped eating, lay on the sofa, and cried. Veronica had become like a mother to him. For him there was no distinction. Ever since he was little, he would come to the cemetery and talk to her exact replica. And when he met her, found out how kind she was, Bale became very attached to her. The boy had to call a doctor. He prescribed vitamins and sedatives and convinced Bale that the more positive he was, the better chance he had of doing well. Even in the worst case you have to eat, you have to study well for your mom, to make her proud of you. My mother died a long time ago, but I remember her with a smile and live, so that she would laugh with me from heaven, not worry about me. This conversation was difficult. Henry stood outside the door, a tear streaming down his man's cheek. Will he have to talk to the grave again, too? It's monstrous, unfair. Antonina was worried, too. She began going to church often, praying, fasting. She overdid it and had to call an ambulance. You don't fast at your age. You need to eat normally, the doctor told her. The doctor diagnosed an exacerbation of gastritis. I'm afraid that if I eat just a little bit too much, God will take Bale's mother away. There's no way they can find her. And I started praying, asking forgiveness for everyone, keeping all the commandments just so she'd come back. The aunt was already aware of the situation in their home. You know, I'm a believer too, but you have to have faith in yourself too. And your diet, believe me, has nothing to do with where Veronica is now. You need to take care of your grandson. Why are you ruining yourself? The grandmother listened to the doctor's words. If you take me to the hospital, he will be all alone. Can't you do it without hospitalization? The doctor sighed. You can, but you'll go to the clinic and get a gastric exam. What? You'll have to swallow a hose, too, frowned Antonina. Very desirable. But at least you'll get an ultrasound. And the medication I prescribe, drink until the doctor gets the results of your examinations and prescribes something of his own. Rose was worried. She told everyone that Veronica was alive, that she could feel it and bail at one point. Tired of it, he yelled at Rose, "You're lying, you can't feel. You're nobody to each other, and I'm her son. And I feel like she's dead. Also, the police said they haven't found her in 2 weeks." Rose shook her head. "It's not about the blood. I can't explain it, but something in me tells me quite clearly that she'll be all right. Bale, you have to have faith." She supported everyone, but she was worried sick. Henry also tried to be strong for everyone. He spent all his free time with the children. During those 2 months, they visited every park and amusement center in town, watched every children's show and session. Bale was distracted when he was in crowded places. After all, he was still very young. But every time they went home, he would start crying because he knew his mother wasn't waiting for him there. Henry got tired of seeing him cry. He decided to take the search into his own hands. The police didn't give any new information for 2 months, only reporting back Henry went to Victor first thing. He learned that Veronica had continued to work for the company after his breakup, but as a regular employee. Henry entered the office and forcibly pulled him from his chair. Victor was confused. He was bigger, but Henry was intimidated by his attitude alone. He walked up to Victor and, holding him by the chest, asked, "Where is she? What did you do to her, you freak?" Victor recalled nearly destroying his family and didn't even try to free himself. "I didn't do anything and I don't know where she is," he said. Henry didn't believe him. "You vindictive prick. Almost ruined my marriage. Said a hell of a lot of things. You made my wife sick, and you were only there to take her company. And don't tell me it isn't true," Henry said. Victor sighed and looked Henry in the eye differently. "I'm sorry it came out that way. I was angry. But the thing about Veronica, I had nothing to do with it," he said. "You have to believe me. I'm worried about it myself. Among other things, I had feelings for her. I'd been drinking for a long time when she left me, and I still hoped she'd forgive me. I probably would have given a lot to find her," Victor said. Henry let Victor go and looked him in the eye for a long time without saying a word. He wondered if Victor was telling the truth. How to make sense of it? Should I believe his words or not? Victor sat back down in his chair. Henry didn't answer anything. "I don't care whether you believe me or not. I don't have to explain anything to you at all. If you don't care, then let me do my job," Victor said. For some reason, Henry felt that he had to protect Veronica like a sister. She had once been his patient, and he was responsible for her. She had become very dear to Rose, too. It's so strange family members can sometimes be so distant and incomprehensible to us, and complete strangers walk into our lives without knocking and stay forever, as if they've always been there. "Henry," I pondered this while sitting in my car. The end of fall was cold and wet. Ice-cold water was flowing under the glass. Even in the morning, the puddles were covered with a film of ice and crunched underfoot. He made his way home, where he stared at one point for a long time, sitting on the couch in the living room. What to do? Elizabeth came up to him. She was already home. The school had cut classes. "Why are you sad?" she asked, like her usually loving daughter. "Thinking of ways to find my mother." The girl sighed. "Maybe we should call the detectives." "Do we have someone who looks like Sherlock Holmes?" she asked. Henry looked slowly at his daughter. From the mouths of babes speaks the truth, he thought. How it had not occurred to him to consult a professional. Henry had found the best men in town who specialized in finding missing persons and had connections in all government agencies. He was a licensed private detective. Henry paid him generously, and the result was not long in coming. On the first day, the detective found more information than the police had learned. Still, he had the necessary connections and was not overloaded like the local law enforcement officers. A few more days went by, and Henry got a call straight to work. "This is Donald, a private investigator. I found her." These words sounded like thunder from out of the blue. Here Henry sank into a chair in his office at work, vividly squeezed out of himself, imagining that he would soon have to tell Bale, "Yes, she's alive, but she needs to be identified, and she also needs surgery. Rare blood type. The patient is undocumented. Doctors have been holding her a long time. She's not regaining consciousness. I'm told she needs surgery to remove a hematoma from her head. She's at the 17th hospital." The detective gave me the full address. Veronica happened to be in the next town over. How she got there was a mystery. That must have made it difficult to find her. The local hospitals would have found her long ago. Henry said it was just luck. They went together. The doctor showed the patient, and Rose cried, "That's her. I'll do anything but save her. We don't have the right blood. We even checked with our own. Without it, she's stable on meds. But there's no improvement. Her body's weakened. Blood is being produced little by little, but that's all. If the hematoma is not removed, she may not come to her senses or remain disabled. There's a great chance of partial memory loss or complete amnesia. She could remain a vegetable. Half the time these injuries result in instant death, but she struggles." "What kind of blood is needed?" Henry asked. He didn't know yet how he'd get it, but he knew he'd turn the city upside down if he had to. He could start with the patient database. Surely there would be at least one match. There couldn't be any other. Fourth, negative. We hardly ever have any patients like that. We've already checked with our database and called the holders of this group. But they all have abnormalities that prevent them from becoming donors. We did one transfusion. We had a supply in the beginning when it was first brought to us. But now we can't find blood. Even neighboring hospitals have asked for it. It's rare, I can tell you. What complicates matters is that the patient has no policy. Our operatives photographed her, but her face is distorted. She must have been beaten. Search was inconclusive. It's a miracle you turned up at all, isn't it? "It's me," Rose screamed. "I have the same blood. I'm ready right now. Let's do whatever it takes. We'll pay. Just please give her back to us. Her little son needs her." The boy is the son of her twin sister. He buried one mother and only found a second exact replica of her. Do you understand? She must not die. The doctor scurried about. Rose was taken away. Henry paid for the urgency, and in 20 minutes the result was ready. Rose was the perfect donor. While the transfusion was going on, the doctor approached Henry. "She's a sister with the victim, isn't she?" he asked, nodding at his wife lying in the room. No. They are just good friends. Strange. They have identical facial features. I would have said without a blood test that they are close relatives, and even the blood type is rare. Weird is a very, I would say, unique case. An exception to all the rules. The doctor adjusted his glasses and left for the ward. After the transfusion, Rose was sent home. The patient's information was found and entered into the database. The doctors recommended surgery at another clinic. There was a wonderful doctor in town who specialized in such cases. Henry moved Veronica there, and they began to prepare her. He withdrew a large sum of money from the account and gave it to her for treatment without any hesitation. It's too bad she's not regaining consciousness. It's been a long time since she was injured. Have you informed her relatives yet? The surgeon who was to perform the operation asked him. No, she only has her grandmother and her son. They can't be bothered. I should know what you say. They've been in such agony waiting too long. You don't give any guarantees. Right. There are no guarantees that her body will survive the surgery, that there will be improvement, that she will come out of the coma. But if she doesn't survive the surgery, I think the family should at least be able to say goodbye to her. Henry nodded. Yes, you're right. I'll bring them in today. Saying that to Bale was very hard. Antonina took the information firmly, but Bale cried and took a long time to calm down. He roared all the way to the hospital. After all, Henry reported that his mother was not regaining consciousness, that the doctors did not know anything for sure, but that they would do everything they could to make her well. As the boy stood there holding her hand, saying the simple words, everyone cried, Elizabeth, Antonina, and Henry and Rose. He begged her to come back to him, not to leave. The surgeon had to interrupt the scene. The operating room is ready. We need to get started. They took her away, and Bale sat down on the couch in the waiting room, sobbing. The surgery lasted 2.5 hours. When the doctors came out of there, Bale ran up to them the very first. Your mom's alive, alive, smiled the elderly surgeon, who was also present for the operation. Is she going to be all right? Asked the boy with a trembling lip. We're not gods, kid. We can't make any promises. But it went well. Your mom has a young, healthy body. She should live. Now the next week will tell what's what. Henry's doctor said separately and explained more in the language of medicine. Henry then sent everyone home, and Bale really wanted to stay in the hospital. But the doctor said his mom would still be in the IQ for now. It was necessary for safety just in case. What did the surgeon tell you? Asked Rose. She stood in her nightgown in the middle of the kitchen. Henry was smoking by the window. He rarely did, so he didn't get used to it. But when his nerves gave out, he couldn't do it without a cigarette. If she doesn't wake up in the next few days, there's very little chance. She'll lie there for years. The heart works, but the brain doesn't function. It's not dead, of course, but its resources are only enough for physiology. Doctors can't promise anything. The brain isn't fully understood. There's so much we just don't know, Henry said, and Rose hugged him from behind, snuggling into the strong man's back. And somehow I'm sure it's going to be okay, Rose said, and smiled genuinely. Henry had already opened his mouth to object, but he was interrupted by a phone call. Veronica just regained consciousness. You asked to be notified. We're doing all the necessary procedures. Don't worry, come in the morning, the phone said. Rose heard what was said over the phone. She laughed happily and hugged her husband. I told you so, she said. Henry hugged his wife, not understanding whether she was crazy or magical. Where did she get that kind of faith? The next day, Bale stood beside his mother, holding her hand. She was weak, squeezing his fingers and smiling with just her eyes. The doctors had warned him not to see her yet, but they made an exception for his son. Bale babbled on, talking about everything she'd missed. He was happy. The doctor explained to him that his mother wasn't allowed to talk yet, so she couldn't be asked anything, only told something. He only stayed with her for 10 minutes. That was enough for the first time. After a few more days, the swelling began to go down. We removed the large hematoma. The prognosis is now positive, both for her life and the functioning of her brain. We're seeing a positive trend every day. And if this continues, she will make a full recovery and return to a full life, the doctor said. As soon as she was transferred to her room, police officers immediately came in and collected the necessary data for the investigation. I remember stopping in the road. There was a young girl standing there. It was chilly and she needed help. I slowed down and the stranger started confusingly explaining that she had something smoking under the hood and the engine had stalled. I went to look and asked if there was a tether. After that, I was thrown to the ground. The girl had gone somewhere. 2 guys swooped in and started hitting me, trying to stifle me. It was like they were robbing for the first time, and there was no way they could make me lose consciousness. I yelled that they could take me away, but they kept hitting me. Eventually, I just passed out. Then I remembered the intense pain. I tried to open my eyes. I remember the smell of earth and blood on my hands. And then it went completely dark. I don't remember anything else. I woke up here and found that I had been in a coma for over a month. Bale wouldn't leave his mother's side. They tried to take him home in the evening, but he clung to the foot of the bed and said he could only be taken out of here by force or with his mother. Henry arranged with the doctor to have bail allowed to stay. Given that he was fully paying for Veronica's stay at the clinic, the doctors, of course, agreed. Their son was given a bed in his room and fed. Veronica was in the hospital for almost another month. 2 weeks later, the doctors allowed her to bring a laptop computer into the room and conduct business. Everyone at the firm was excited about her return, and especially Victor. He came to the hospital with a huge bouquet of her favorite yellow roses. Veronica accepted the bouquet, but did not give Victor even hope for a second chance. He asked her to forgive him and left. From that day on, he was just an ordinary employee in her company. One day she was being discharged from the hospital. She was met by Rose. Henry was there too. He was waiting in the car. The doctor who had performed the surgery came up to them. The resemblance is striking. A colleague of mine from another clinic told me that you have the same blood type and that, despite your outward similarity, you are not related. That's really a unique case. Rose frowned. Do we look alike? I've never noticed. My own sisters sometimes don't look alike at all. But the fact that you have the same rare blood type, that you live in the same city, it makes you wonder if you should take a DNA test. I already have one sister. Just like that by chance. I wouldn't be surprised if there was another. Veronica smiled. We celebrated the hospital discharge with family at home. When Veronica returned to work, her colleagues also threw her a little party. She was happy. But the one who rejoiced the most, of course, was Bale with all the events, the boy. Abandoned his studies, and there was already talk about his expulsion. But an influential mother intervened. Veronica promised that by the end of the quarter, Bale would catch up with the other kids. The tutors who came to his house to tutor him helped. Elizabeth also helped. She loved spending time with him. Who knows, maybe they'll grow up and get married. Veronica dreamed. They strolled peacefully through the park with Rose and Henry. The doctor said in one voice that you look a lot like your siblings. Really? He asked. Unfortunately, Mom and Dad are gone, and there's no one to ask. But I don't think so. Mom and I look alike, Rose said. And if you look closely, we do look like you and your mom, Henry blurted out. He remembered Rose's parents poorly, mostly from photographs. Come on. There's no such thing. Let's do a test if you want. I'll bet you a case of champagne that Rose and I aren't related. Veronica said, I'll take the bet. As a medical professional, I'll side with the doctors. Henry boldly held out his hand to her. Are you serious? Rose asked. Veronica and Henry nodded in sync. Thanks to the businesswoman's connections, passing the test was very easy. They drove to the clinic where they had been tested earlier to confirm Bale and Veronica's kinship and to disprove Bale and Henry's kinship. A familiar doctor escorted the women into a white-walled office, and they had samples taken for Veronica. It was just fun for Rose, but Henry did suspect that perhaps the two girlfriends had drunk for a reason. The next day, Veronica came to the house herself. In the afternoon, she had an envelope in her hand, torn across the top. Hi, this is our test come. What kind of champagne do you prefer? Rose asked her. More like, what kind of champagne does Henry prefer? Held out the envelope to her friend. 99.9s. They were siblings, even though they were separated. How can that be? Rose marveled. I think we should go to a professional again, Henry said, and dialed a familiar number. A few days later, the private investigator reported information he had learned through old acquaintances of the orphanage workers and Rose's neighbors. Your mother Mary was very devout, Rose knew. She was her oldest daughter. Apparently, the pregnancy was an accident, and she was very ashamed. But it was even scarier for a religious person to terminate her life. You were just a child and may not remember it. Your mother went out of town for 3 months. A neighbor was looking after you. She told me about it. Maria gave birth to twins and left them there in the maternity hospital. She was afraid of being judged by her temple, So she hid the pregnancy from everyone. Said she had to get treatment from everyone. Said she had to get treatment. She wasn't really sick. She wasn't really sick. She was expecting twins. It was your sister who was born later. She was weaker than you. She was admitted to the children's hospital right away. You were adopted in spite of the fact that it was not advisable to separate the twins. I don't know if the child welfare officers reported it. And who cared at the time? It was hard on everyone. They tried to clothe and feed every child. I learned that from a worker at the orphanage where your sister was placed. They took her away too, but later. She was 5 at the time. She was 5 at the time. She most likely remembered the orphanage, though it happens that children are psycho-emotionally traumatized. Heavy events are not remembered, the detective said, and left. Antonina had only one thing to say about it. Yes, I sheltered her. She got lost and fought off the other kids on the walk. I saw her in the winter and realized that I wanted to have a baby. I knew at the time that I couldn't have children of my own, but it wasn't that important to me. It was hard to survive as it was. And with children, we were even worse. I found out where this girl was from and took her in. Then there wasn't so much paperwork to do. And there wasn't so much paperwork to do. And there wasn't as much red tape as there is now. I came and said, I want to take her away, and they were glad. One less orphan, she said. It took Rose a long time to realize that it was all true and not a prank. Veronica bought a case of champagne, apparently as promised. Rose was now her own sister, and they were more than just girlfriends. They still saw each other often. They visited her third sisters. Grave together, and Elizabeth and Bale were delighted to hear that they were brother and sister to each other. Only with Veronica's personal life something did not work out. After Victor, she had been hesitant to let anyone near her for a long time. Rose offered options and asked her to look at a neighbor, a colleague, or an attending physician. Henry also wished her marital happiness. They were all helped by a happy accident. One day Veronica ordered a pizza while Rose and Elizabeth were visiting. The delivery guy turned out to be a solid guy in company clothes. Veronica rallied, and they were about to start eating when suddenly a long bell rang from behind the door. Veronica opened it and saw the same pizza delivery guy on the doorstep. I'm sorry, for God's sake, I got it all mixed up. It's an order for another girl. You're cheese pizza, and she's cheese intolerant. An intolerance. Confused, the guy asked. Veronica laughed. The pizza was changed, and the delivery guy left. The pizza was changed, and the delivery guy left. His name tag read Robert. However, just as the second box was opened, the doorbell rang again. Veronica opened it again. What is it? I'm hungry. Disgruntled, she said. The sweetest young man on the doorstep smiled charmingly and said, Sorry again. May I have a word with your friend Veronica? She smiled. A sister, not a friend, and she's not married. That doesn't bother you? No, Robert smiled. Rose approached him. They whispered about something for a few minutes, and then Rose closed the door behind him. If he comes back again, I'll throw something at him, she said. The maid wasn't in the house that day, wasn't used to opening the door that many times in a row. The housekeeper usually did that, and she didn't have guests that often either. He won't. He'll call you, Rose said, as if nothing had happened. Daddy asked me for your number. I gave it to him. Calm down. I said you were a guest. I own the house too, and you work in a candy store yourself. And he didn't care. He just liked you. In fact, he was so wildly embarrassed he could hardly speak. His name is Robert. He's 28, and he has a daughter. He's a widower, and this is the first time he's liked someone. After a long break in a relationship. That's all I know. And why he's working at 28 as a pizza delivery boy is kind of unreasonable. Veronica frowned. Rose sighed heavily. It's not solid. Come on. Who cares what he works for? Does it really matter? Rose proceeded to eat the pizza. Veronica decided to give the guy a chance. He may be younger, but he has a kid. That wasn't bad. considering Veronica couldn't have children. She waited for Robert to call and agreed to meet him. The spark sparked instantly. Robert was moonlighting on a delivery job because he needed to fill in for his brother. He was sick and didn't want to lose his job. Robert himself was a lawyer. Raised 6-year-old Victoria on his own, paid the mortgage. He was simple and modest, and on the third date he invited Veronica to his home. His daughter of the guests really liked it, and Veronica herself just fell in love with Victoria. They began to meet, went for walks together with their children more often. Veronica saw a difference between the way Victor had behaved and the way Victor had behaved and the way Robert now treated her. He was gentle, loving, caring, kept in touch with the family of his wife who died in a plane crash, brought Victoria to them. The girl grew up very creative. She sang beautifully, learned to dance. She remembered her mother and missed her very much. But to Veronica, treated kindly. Robert said that Victoria was the first person she immediately fell in love with. After his wife died, he was alone for a long time. Her parents themselves tried to introduce him to young women. They treated Robert as their own son. Only none of the chosen ones did not like Victoria. And Robert at the time was just not ready for a new relationship. But he was embarrassed to say so directly. Still, his wife's parents were trying. Veronica quickly realized that this was the kind of relationship she had always wanted. He was the man of her dreams. And within 4 months, they were living together. Robert persuaded Veronica to sell her huge house and move into his small apartment. She agreed but didn't sell the house. She left it as an inheritance. And Rose, now 47, didn't know she was expecting a child. She and Henry would become parents again. This time the ultrasound was sure to show a boy. If you like the story, I hope you don't mind supporting me with the thumbs up button. It means a lot to me. All the best.